Okay, try to picture this. It's the summer of 1914. War is looming. And here in London, the absolute nerve center of global finance, oh, everything just goes haywire. Complete chaos.
hmm All the established ideas, the financial theories, they suddenly seem useless.
Yeah, predictions are way off. It's a kind of financial meltdown nobody had really seen before.
And it's amazing how quickly that system, which seems so solid, just buckled under the pressure. The sources we have really paint this picture of near-instant collapse in the everyday machinery of finance.
People were scrambling, weren't they? Trying to figure out what was happening, what to do.
Exactly. It wasn't just some academic debate anymore. It was immediate, existential.
And that's precisely the moment we're diving into today. We've got this fascinating source, a book written right in the middle of it all, 1915. It's by Walter William Wall, called The War and Our Financial Fabric.
Right, and his goal was basically to make sense of what he himself called the greatest of financial crises.
He saw things like banking, credit, currency. They were already tricky subjects, right? Complex, contentious were his words.
Yeah, he points out that even the experts, the academics, they couldn't agree on how it all worked. The war just ripped the lid off everything.
So Wall was trying to cut through that confusion, find some clarity.
That was the aim, to take the raw, painful experience of 1914 and pull out some real lessons about how finance actually worked or didn't work when things got really tough.
So that's our mission for this deep dive, to unpack Wall's arguments from back then, using his own words as much as possible. What did he think really mattered about finance, wealth, and crucially, confidence during this extreme stress test?
What lessons did he think were to be learnt? That's his phrase. How could this crisis help people see these, age-old problems with greater clearness?
And we should acknowledge, obviously, this is a snapshot from 1915, a gold standard world, very different plumbing in the financial system than today.
Definitely. But Bow's digging into fundamental ideas about wealth, about trust, human psychology, and finance. You might find some surprising echoes, even now.
Okay, so let's jump in where Wall starts. The basic question, but one he thinks is crucial. What actually is money?
Right, because he draws a distinction right away. He says, look, anything may be money, practically speaking.
If you can exchange it for something else.
Yeah. His example is, say you offer your gold watch to a tailor for a new suit. If the tailor accepts it, the watch just functions as money in that specific deal. It's about the use in exchange.
But that's not the same as legal tender currency.
Exactly. Legal tender is different. That's what the government, the legislature, arbitrarily selects, as he put it. It's the official stuff you have to accept for debts, for taxes.
He mentioned things like cattle or iron bars being used historically for taxes.
So your diamond necklace might be incredibly valuable, but it's not legal tender. The watch could work in a private trade, but the government won't take it for your taxes.
Okay, and he links this idea of legal tender to society, using this analogy of a common store.
Yeah, the common store or market. We all contribute our work, our goods, and then these goods are divided unequally. The legal currency, these government-approved tickets, are your permanent claims on that community store. You need them to live.
Right. Now, this leads us to where Wall really starts pushing back against the common thinking of his time, especially about banks.
Oh, definitely. His central argument, and he's quite firm on it, is that banks do not, in the true connotation of the word, create credit.
Which must have sounded controversial because people saw banks taking in, say, £200.
And lending out way more, maybe £1,000, £2,000. So the natural assumption was, well, they must be making money, creating credit, just like magic.
A bank fairy, as he puts it.
He says, no, that's not what's happening.
So if they aren't creating it, what are they doing? How does that £200 become £2,000 in loans?
Wall's view is that they're transforming something else. They're taking the nation's existing wealth and turning it into liquid capital, into currency that can actually be used.
Ah, so it's not creation ex nihilo out of nothing, it's conversion.
Exactly. Building a superstructure of wealth, he calls it. Banks are the mechanism that makes existing wealth flow, makes it productive.
I like his analogy for this. He talks about unfreezing or sawing capital.
Yes, like taking fixed capital, which is maybe illiquids like ice, and turning it into flowing water, usable currency.
Okay, so that £200 deposit turning into £2,000 of lending, that's not magic. It's the bank lending against security.
Precisely. The security property, deeds, stocks, inventories, whatever, that represents real wealth.
Yeah.
When the bank lends against that security, it's essentially converting that underlying less liquid wealth into spendable currency for the borrower.
It's liquefying the nation's assets.
That's his core idea, liquefying wealth, not inventing credit.
So, following that logic, things like checks,
Yeah.
they work as a kind of money not because they're legal tender.
But because they're claims on bank funds, which are ultimately backed by this transformed wealth held as security.
They become currency of custom.
Right. Not legal tender, but functioning as money because people trust the bank's foundation in real wealth. He sees checks as vital, actually, a sign of an advanced stage of economics and of civilization, distinct from legal tender, but still part of the nation's working currency.
Okay, this reframing of banking then leads into another big issue, wall tackles, bank reserve.
Hmm.
The gold or legal tender banks have to keep on hand.
Mm-hmm. And the fundamental tension there. As he says, banks cannot keep a high proportion of reserves and in the same moment lend freely.
It's a catch-22. If they hoard reserves, they're not lending, which he says is like a great destruction of capital because that wealth isn't being put to work.
But if they lend freely, their reserves go down, which looks risky.
And Wall seems really skeptical about finding safety just by sticking to a mathematical formula, right? Like saying, oh, we have 30% reserve, so we're safe.
Deeply skeptical. He calls it relying on exact mathematical formulas, or a theoretic line of safety. He questions whether any specific ratio actually prevents panic.
He uses that great little story.
Oh, the highly nervous old gentleman. Yeah, try to calm down a worried customer about his 100-pound deposit by telling him, don't worry, we actually have 15 pounds or maybe 40 pounds of it in reserve, and trust us, the ratio is sound.
It doesn't exactly inspire confidence, does it?
No. Wall's point is that simply stating a number doesn't fix the psychological fear.
So if ratios aren't the answer, where does Wall see real banking safety coming from?
From sound banking methods, which for him fundamentally means banks being good at transforming the best kind of wealth, solid, durable wealth, into currency.
Regardless of the exact gold reserve number.
Irrespective of mathematical gold reserves, is his phrase. Real safety, he argues, comes from this feeling of confidence. And where does that confidence come from? From the public's own intelligence and common sense in recognizing sound practice.
So attempts to automatically manage reserves, like hiking the bank rate to attract gold, Wall thinks they miss the point.
He argues they don't address the basic need for an elastic legal tender system. You need some way to get a supplementary inflow of currency when demand spikes, not just shuffle the existing gold around. Relying solely on gold mining output just fetters everything.
Okay, this is bringing us to what feels like the absolute heart of Wall's analysis. Confidence.
Yes. And he draws a really sharp line between genuine confidence and what people often just call credit, especially Lombard Street credit.
That distinction seems critical. What's the difference for him?
Well, credit in the Lombard Street sense might just mean banks have the capacity to lend. But confidence, for Wall, is something much deeper. It's a confiding in the greatness of the nation.
So you could have lots of lending capacity, lots of credit.
But if confidence is gone, Wall says all this credit is impotent. Useless. It just sits there.
He has that sarcastic bit about imagining a financial news report saying,
Yeah. Confidence in Lombard Street yesterday was in superabundant supply. Sellers could find no borrowers of it. He says writing that would excite derision because confidence isn't a commodity you can trade like that.
it's something else entirely.
Exactly. And because it's not a thing you can just pile up, it's not regenerated by building mountainous gold reserves.
So how is it regenerated, according to Wall?
By a new faith in the essential greatness and wealth of the country.
And he saw the 1914 crisis itself as evidence for this.
Absolutely. He argued that confidence returned not just because of gold movements, but because people saw or came to believe in the soundness of our banking system, the strength of our financial structure, and the wisdom of our government, and even the soul of the nation.
So that feeling, that belief, is what overcame the fear and the doomsayers.
That's his argument. Confidence is the energizing, vitalizing spirit of economic progress. He compares it to the role that faith plays in religion.
Wow. And he says it actually increases wealth.
Yes, because it imparts the energy to produce and consume. Pessimism, conversely, is like an infectious disease that destroys wealth.
So when panic hits, it's not just a problem of liquidity or reserves.
For Wall, it's fundamentally a psychological disease.
And the cure isn't just more gold.
No, the cure has to be psychological too. Knowledge and common sense, not just tinkering with ratios or hoarding metal. He points to how calmly the public accepted the emergency treasury notes in 1914 as proof of this national common sense, this psychological strength.
Okay, let's dig into those specific lessons from 1914 a bit more. What were the big disruptions Wall highlights?
Well, the first massive shock was the stock exchange closing its doors.
Right. And the effect of that was?
It instantly froze up a considerable portion of the wealth possessed by banks and the public. Stocks, bonds. Suddenly you couldn't easily sell them or borrow against them. That wealth became useless for exchange or production. Huge parts of the system just seized up.
And it wasn't just domestic, right? The international side broke down too.
Completely. Foreign exchange markets basically stopped working. You couldn't easily settle international debts or finance trade. And bills of exchange, the sort of lifeblood of trade finance back then, they also became frozen. Useless.
So in this situation, with wealth frozen and the mechanisms broken, what did Wall think was the only way forward?
He was very clear. The only sensible course for the nation to take is to be its own physician.
Meaning the government had to step in.
Yes. He said the government can do again what it did last year, 1914, provide a supplementary fund of legal tender currency. He saw it as essential.
And justified by the crisis itself.
Absolutely. He argued that the raw experience of the crisis was of greater value than theory. What worked, worked.
And the prime example of what worked was the government issuing those treasury notes.
Exactly. He saw this as the government creating a new fiduciary currency. It wasn't backed by a specific pile of gold in a vault somewhere.
But by the overall credit or wealth of the country.
Right. And why did people accept them? Wall says it's because they fundamentally trusted the nation's underlying wealth and power. People felt these notes were as good as gold. Convertibility wasn't the main concern for most.
So this emergency currency provided that crucial supplementary inflow when the gold-based system was jammed.
That's exactly how Wall saw it. And he really hammers home how this whole experience just flew in the face of many established theories and predictions.
Like what?
Well, for one, the predicted mass panic, the run on banks for gold by the public, it didn't really happen on the scale feared.
And the foreign exchanges, didn't they behave unexpectedly too?
Yes, instead of collapsing against Britain, the exchanges often moved in its favor, reflecting its underlying strength as a major creditor nation. Things didn't unfold the way the textbook said they should.
Wall credits the government's actions here too, right? For preventing worse panic.
He does. He argues that things like the government advancing funds and, importantly, telling banks quite firmly to stop hoarding gold and meet demands actually removed the incentive for the public to hoard and help justify confidence.
Okay, then there's that weird situation Wall describes after the initial shock settles down. Gold actually starts flowing into London.
Yeah, leading to this glut of cheap money. He says loanable capital has actually depreciated. Money was theoretically cheap to borrow.
But banks still weren't lending much.
Right, because the type of wealth they normally lent against those stocks, bonds, bills exchange was still largely frozen or suspect.
So loads of gold, cheap borrowing rates, but the lending engine is stalled. That sounds like a paradox.
Wall says it's only a paradox if you think money supply is just about gold. His point is that having piles of idle gold isn't productive. Gold's value lies in its ability to facilitate the transformation and exchange of real wealth. If that wealth is frozen, the gold doesn't help much.
So what's the ultimate takeaway for Wall regarding safety and who guarantees the system? It's not individual bank reserves.
No, he's adamant. In a real systemic crisis, individual reserves won't cut it. Only the government, that is the nation, can insure us against disaster.
He sees it as the government's duty.
Yes, partly because the government restricts banking through laws tied to gold, preventing what he calls truly free banking. Therefore, the government has a responsibility to step in. He suggests banks need to be seen as interconnected, perhaps needing reserves pooled with state backing in a crisis.
He brings up the post office savings bank again here, doesn't he?
As an example of trust based purely on the nation's backing, not on any visible gold reserve. People trusted it because they trusted the state.
So wrapping up Wall's view, the financial fabric isn't just about numbers and rules.
Not at all. He explicitly calls it a psychological product, something that emerges from the soul of the nation. He's quite critical of banks, sometimes acting out of undignified rivalry instead of focusing on their vital national role.
And he keeps coming back to the government's actions in 1914, providing that emergency currency.
Yes, he sees its wisdom and efficacy as being strikingly demonstrated. He believes it taught deep lessons about Britain's strength and set crucial precedents for handling future crises.
He even quotes Lloyd George. something about not just worshiping gold.
Right, about the need to actually use resources like gold freely when required, not just hoard it like a golden calf, and recognizing that paper currency, within limits, has essential value.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize Wall's core message from 1915. He's saying banking is fundamentally about transforming real wealth into usable currency.
Not just creating credit from thin air.
Hmm.
And that confidence, deep confidence in the nation itself, is way more important than gold ratios or mathematical formulas.
And government action to provide liquidity in a crisis. That's not necessarily bad, it can be essential, based on hard-won experience.
And underpinning it all is psychology. Fear, trust, common sense, national character, these are fundamental drivers of financial stability, maybe even more than the technical stuff.
So as you, our listeners, think about this 1915 perspective, how does it land today? Do Wall's ideas about transforming wealth versus creating credit still echo in modern finance debates? Discussions around quantitative easing or central bank roles.
And what about psychology? Is confidence, or the lack of it, fear, panic, euphoria? Are these still the dominant forces in markets, especially during crises? Think about 2008 or the COVID shock. How has that role of government and central banks changed since 1915? And what fundamentally do you think underpins confidence in our financial system now?
What is the wealth being transformed today? Is it still physical assets or more intangible things? And who or what do we rely on as the ultimate backstop when things go wrong?
Maybe here's a final thought, drawing from Wall. He saw panic as a disease of the mind, countered by faith and national strength. Could it be that financial crises deep down are really about breakdowns in our collective trust? Not just trust in banks or rules, but trust in each other, and in the future viability of that common store he talked about.